there's definitely only a few battles in naval history around the world that really stand out, and Midway is, of course, one of them. We're talking today about the 1976 film, and then the 2019 version more recently, Untitled Chapter with Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
I think what I'll kind of start off with today's Father's Day, and with the kind of this little bit of sad news that my dad passed away a few days ago, stuff like that. So appreciate kind of the kind words that folks have shared and stuff like that on Facebook, and yeah, I think one question or one thought that I had was about that. I feel like in some ways, because whether you have a dad who's kind of really there in your life, or in my case, it was a mix where we didn't really have kind of close times and stuff. But I'd say that because Dad was so busy for that early stage when we came to this country, a lot of times he was absent and everything, and so I felt like in some ways that the film and television was almost like a surrogate. Like kind of some ways, I was raised on kind of these movies and kind of basically kind of indoctrinating these ideals of kind of what does it mean to be a man, and kind of in the modern world, stuff like that. I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts about kind of the influence that different films and television shows have had on you and stuff like that growing up.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it is somewhat similar. I guess back in the late 70s, early 80s, the concept that screen time was bad for you was not really a thing. And so most of the time we sat around and watched TV. That was what we did. And that tended to be somewhat occasionally a struggle between my mum and my dad, of my mum wanting to watch just about anything and it being vaguely inappropriate for me, and my dad sort of going, should we not be watching something a little bit more educational here? Right. My mum goes, no, Rocky Horror Picture Show, that's fine. That's there's lots of interesting cultural stuff in there. Right. So, yeah, but I think it's as well, interestingly, in terms of war movies, one of the things that I really loved as a kid was the soundtracks to war movies. And that was actually really the first music I actually really listened to properly was old vinyl records of Where Eagles Dare, Battle of Britain, things like this. These really cool war movie soundtracks.
Yeah, there's something to that of and you'd almost think that you'd just be, they would all just sound martial and stuff, and yeah, there's a lot of that, and there's a certain kind of sound quality to kind of the music that's in these war movies and stuff. But I think there's also they really kind of bring in classical music in a way that a typical movie that has it. There's layers. In other words, it's not all kind of let's go off to battle, or let's fight, stuff like that. I think different times, Victory at Sea is another one that comes to mind. That this, I think there's a lot of these moments that it's just these kind of transitions. It's kind of kind of giving you the sense that of for lack of a better way to put it, having served and stuff like that, there's a lot of waiting, the things that we see, kind of the action of movies basically compress, all the boredom of the waiting that you have, between battles and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's because I should point out, whilst I haven't served, I did work with some military guys when I worked for the MOD in England, and yeah, they did explain that there's a huge amount of waiting, and then all of a sudden you're just thrown into complete chaos. So it's a very kind of, must be a very odd experience really to go through that, how your time is divided like that.
So I think, I think that's actually a good transition into these movies then, because here in the 76 version, it's an interesting kind of opening sequence that they have. You're seeing kind of some kind of raid going on, and it turns out, kind of as you find out later on, it's the Doolittle Raid, which was really to me, that is one of the things that really exemplifies the kind of the mix of that the technology was advancing, but meanwhile they were really taking chances and kind of just experimenting with things that like just was never done before, because you're launching these bombers off of these aircraft carriers where they barely fit and stuff like that. There was no catapults like nowadays. Like kind of jet aircraft were launched, like literally by these catapults and stuff, and that didn't even exist back then. These planes were going by, and we'll see in the 2019 version, by the kind of the sheer will of the pilot, and the engines kind of just push at the maximum and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was it's one of those things. The historical significance of trying to sort of land an attack on mainland Japan, that hadn't been done, was a very sort of interesting psychological tactic, I think. And I mean, that was my overriding impression from the 76 version, is that it was a movie predominantly about the strategy of how the war was how that battle was fought, interspersed with some kind of interesting real footage from the time, which gave it some, a very interesting, authentic kind of look. But it was.
And the 76 is interesting for that, because on the one hand they jam-packed it with we'll definitely get into the stars that kind of just, I mean, it's pretty much you're talking about like the list of the stars from the 70s, they're in it, like kind of, at least for the males. Like, I mean, that's what's interesting too, that of course there's really no role for the women and stuff like that, but that's just part of these war movies. At the same time, they used a lot of stock footage to from everything from like Tora to like just on and on, like kind of just the different films that in a documentary, and again, to kind of cut down a budget, they use like kind of like the carriers that they had access to and stuff like that. So we're talking about a time where like practical effects were, or kind of used footage was the way you got the film made and stuff like that.
I mean, I was going to ask you about that, because you probably know more about the actual. I mean, was this actual footage of Midway, or was this just like loads and loads of different footage that just conveniently fit the narrative at that point?
Yeah, that's what's interesting. It's you didn't really. I didn't feel like you kind of. It wasn't as glaring as you would think it'd be. That like basically like I've seen bad war movies where you're like they're editing like kind of. Just footage from like say the Battle of Britain, right, and stuff, and then like where and we're talking like the actual battle and everything that looks like kind of the gun cam kind of footage and everything like that. And the bad ones, like it's kind of like jarring in a little way that like you're seeing this kind of scene in color, and all of a sudden it turns black and white, and kind of it can be very jarring that they kind of make these transitions. But this one, they put the footage from these other movies and stuff, and somehow it works. I mean, just I never felt like you kind of were like you weren't like kind of lost in the fact that like these things were going on, and it's it did feel like that you were watching kind of the battle, and then they kind of mix it up a little bit where like there was some sometimes you could kind of tell it was like models or whatever else and stuff like that, but otherwise like you felt very much. In fact, if anything, I felt like this was better effects wise or kind of footage wise than Top Gun, because different times of Top Gun you felt like you saw like this model kind of blowing up and stuff like that. It's kind of like okay, kind of and that was like an 80s movie and stuff like that, and maybe we'll talk about that someday, but here like the action flowed, and like and then like kind of, even though that like they did just cut these sequences of stuff, I mean you really it just didn't feel very apparent, I guess. It didn't feel very like kind of obvious that they were doing that.
I mean it did make me think of the the great satire of that kind of reusing old war footage is in Airplane,
right,
when you have Ted Stryker recounting how his plane goes down, and it cuts between fighter jets to like the failed Wright brothers kind of experiment style planes crashing and things like this. But yeah, I mean it's it was done quite subtly and quite well in this, I thought, and in terms of the structure of the movie, I felt there was quite a lot of, I mean, it's quite vague, I think, in the setup. And I would say that's the weakness of the movie, is that it's trying to sort of develop the characters of Charlton Heston and this relationship with his son, and the Japanese wife. But it doesn't really give you the bigger picture of what was actually happening between America and Japan and the Pacific at that time. So it's kind of quite slow at the beginning, but I felt once the battle had actually started, the way the movie's paced and the way it intercuts between Japanese, the American generals, and their kind of this battle of sort of minds and strategies was really well done. It did miss that.
Yeah, it was an odd choice. I don't know why. I think why they did it, to be honest, was that that they wanted the kind of this continuity of like kind of take you to like kind of the intel / the battle, and meanwhile like kind of the shore like as a starting point to kind of have some kind of flow for the audience perspective that they kind of more or less achieved in the remake with the latent character stuff. Because what's funny is like Garth, both Heston and the son characters, stuff like that, they're fictional. I mean, they were made up because I think they wanted to kind of have this transition and stuff. But then they I think what's interesting is that in the remake, they kind of do it with Patrick Wilson's character, as we'll talk about, with his actual character of Edward Layton, and then and then they kind of just had the other characters kind of the Dick Best kind of character as like kind of as almost like kind of the other layer of continuity, stuff like that. So I think people definitely have criticized kind of the original movie, the 76 version, for like kind of trying to wedge in the subplot, and then like kind of I appreciate that they kind of were trying to show a little bit of like kind of the American treatment of the Japanese, like kind of I think that was partially the point. But like some of these other modern films that like try to do something with like this more PC or kind of like like kind of like look at how we treated kind of the Japanese and stuff like that. It did feel like a little bit forced into like kind of the narrative and stuff. I think that's what's funny is like kind of anytime we try to do some of these more highbrow kind of ideas, it still comes down to execution, and so you got to do it really well or just don't do it and stuff.
Yeah. But I mean, I would say the performances were pretty decent. I mean, all things considered. I mean, Charlton Heston's good. You got Robert Webber in a role. Don't often see him too much in these kind of, well, maybe in other war movies, but he's got a fairly small role, but quite good. What's he called? Holbrook. Can't remember. Hal Holbrook.
Yeah, so he played Rochefort, and and that's the other key part about it, is just the code breaking. I mean, so that's the thing that both movies really show in its own way and stuff like that. That was a key part of this battle, was the fact that like the Americans caught on to like kind of what the Japanese plans were through the communications, and the Japanese didn't figure out till too late that we knew what was going on and stuff.
Yeah, I would say that's the down for me. That's the sort of the downfall of this movie, is that it's almost sort of portrayed as this game of chess between people, and there's like the intel but I mean, they do nail this point of timing and how critical that was to the success, because the way it plays out, it does, by focusing only on the basically on the people behind the scenes sort of calling the shots, you get this kind of decision-making process and how critical those were in the execution.
Right.
What it loses though is the general overall stakes, and of course what the actual pilots had to go through, which is pretty much lost on this. It all just kind of feels a bit like, yes, we'll just charge on in. Yeah, the boys will do it. All right, let's go home for a glass of beer at the end of the day. We won again. It kind of feels a bit too relaxed considering what actually was going on at that time. So
I mean, they were trying to convey that also. Again, that's why they used the son Tom and stuff like that to like kind of kind of dramatic, again, major spoiler, that like dramatic kind of moment where like he's really critically injured and stuff. So that's how they were trying to kind of inject that. But I think partially it was like the fact that like just they couldn't have they didn't have the technology to create the footage and stuff. That of course in the the remake that and I think that's kind of like we're really going to get into the discussion about like and I think that's a key part about this too is like like on the one hand like kind of what happens when you have the technology and stuff. On the other, like kind of does that necessarily guarantee success? And that's what we kind of what we'll be talking about shortly. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it, really? I mean, now we have the technology to really do very accurate war movies, but, I mean, maybe Dunkirk did all right, but there's not a huge sort of audience for war movies, I don't think. And it's kind of, it's one of those things where it's a bit of a shame in a way, because if you actually put the effort into finding out what happened and also what the kind of stakes were, these, if it's done well and it's done accurately, it's really quite impressive. I mean, yeah, and I would say in terms of, if we're moving on to the remake, I'm not that much of a sort of a history or war buff, but having done a bit of reading on what was going on in the Pacific at that time and watching these movies and seeing how historically accurate the 2019 version was, I actually really enjoyed the 2019 version, and I didn't expect to at all. Because I just assumed it would be, a fairly sort of superficial Hollywoodized version, but
which Pearl Harbor unfortunately was. That's what's ironic. Here's this more accurate movie and stuff, and apparently it was a passion project by Roland Emmerich, who kind of we knew from Godzilla and stuff like that. He really had to go through a lot to cobble together the financing, which we got to point out that like a good chunk of that was kind of the Chinese, surprisingly, which kind of like makes you wonder about kind of the motivation behind kind of like what was happening and stuff like that with that.
Well, I mean, totally understandable. I mean, when we've talked about the atrocities in Nanking and how there's been a systematic effort to try and sort of scrub that from history or deny it. The fact that you can actually put this money into something that does portray. I mean, one of the most shocking things about this that I didn't realize is just the Doolittle attack, and how, because the Chinese guerrillas helped them, they just butchered 250,000 Chinese because they helped the Americans, which is pretty, atrocious, I would say.
Yeah, and that's something that was glossed over in the original stuff like that. I mean, you don't see any of that,
No, and so I thought that was it was interesting to see them actually kind of follow how that Doolittle Raid was actually executed and the stakes, and how a lot of these guys knew that they weren't going to be able to make it back to not even like an American carrier, but not even to like safe land either. That was pretty interesting. But then the retribution was interesting to see yet more. I mean, when you add up all the supposed figures from Nanking and you add this part of the attack on mainland China, that the numbers keep adding up on the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II. It's pretty astounding.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like, kind of a lot of people have not forgotten, and so it's funny how, as you and I kind of looked at offline, that history buffs kind of points out that, like, even though that, like, the again, major spoiler, the closing lines of this movie kind of talks about the respect for both the American and the Japanese sailors, but what's left out is the aspect that, like, just like kind of the cruelty of, like, kind of even the Japanese Navy, as much as like kind of the Army in some ways and stuff. It wasn't on that same kind of scale, but it was like kind of like you only kind of get a glimpse of it as when they did pick up a couple of the pilots and stuff like that, or the crew for one of the attack bombers, and
But even that is dealt with fairly in a fairly restrained way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they didn't give him a cigarette and threw him. They beat them half to death, basically.
In real life.
Yeah. So, and I thought what was really what was good about this one as well was the fact that they gave you the perspective of what had led to this, what really led to the Japanese attacking, and also where they, where they'd already conquered at that stage, because so much World War II history in movies focuses on the Nazis, and you never really get an appreciation of what the Japanese had done or where they'd encroached on. And I mean, it was a lot of areas, most of the Southeast Asia, they were about to getting close to attacking Australia, a lot of mainland China. I mean, it was a lot of territory they managed to get in a very short period of time. And so this, when you hear them say, okay, LA, San Francisco could be next, they're not kidding. They were seriously on the move.
I would say that that's the thing that, like, this movie was really good about, was, like you said, putting things in perspective and making you realize that, like, a key driver was the fact that, like, the Japanese were doing all these things, but behind of how they were achieving it was oil. Like, kind of, like, without oil, they were dead in the water. And so when the U.S. was threatening to, cut off their supply, so to speak, by their actions and stuff, that kind of led to Pearl and stuff like that, and the Japanese kind of finally drawing the U.S. into, the World War II. Because up to that point, the U.S. was like very isolationist. They were like, like, no, nothing on our borders and stuff, and like, kind of, we'll just send aid to different parts of the world, but we're going to stay out of this. But after attacking, kind of, something that was not even really yet on U.S. soil, but just like that was, at that time, Hawaii still wasn't a state, I guess. That's what's interesting. But it was considered like, but it was the American fleet though, and so it was like basically attacking a U.S. embassy, I guess, in some ways, was like kind of that significance. That then they were like, okay, like, this is really getting real, and at that point, like, kind of, and they show you Pearl, like, kind of, the devastation, and it's like Pearl Harbor, as we've said, like, kind of, that movie in itself has kind of like shown it to ad nauseum and stuff like that. This one, like, kind of really, they captured a lot of it, and like, they kind of show it from the perspective, like, kind of, this mom and daughter and stuff like that, and kind of to give you like kind of this perspective, like how devastating the attack was and stuff. But you kind of realize, like, that, like, for the Japanese, what was at stake was like kind of, be able to kind of continue their march to conquer that side of the world. For the U.S. was like basically like, okay, we have to, fight this off. And then that led to, ironically, the Doolittle Raid. So again, we see this, and Eckhart, I thought, was an interesting choice for playing kind of Doolittle and stuff. But he pulls it off. I mean, I think I think for somebody like that, it's basically just like our association with him as this kind of charismatic kind of guy, and I think he kind of shows that, like, like he just looks like he could be the inspirational kind of leader, I guess, of this group that's doing this desperate kind of attempt to take the war to Japan and stuff.
Yeah. And I think it was very important for them to actually show the attack on Pearl Harbor, because it really makes you appreciate then, from a strategic perspective, how many carriers they had and how many they lost. So you can appreciate the stakes of what was what the Battle of Midway would actually have cost them had they lost it. And I think, of course, the interesting difference with this one is now you get point of view from the pilots. You get these very sort of detailed CGI effects of the planes going in, and and I mean, and that was, it really makes you appreciate what kind of insanity it was to be a pilot and make it through. I mean, it's quite something. And even moments, what's nice about this movie is that moments that seem completely cheesy or Hollywoodized, like the one where Guido jumps in the turret and shoots down the bomber, was actually real. That was a real event.
That was strange.
So that's actually what's pretty cool about this, is that everything, that even if it seems over the top, it was actually pretty much real. And there's very little. That's what I was nice about watching the History Buff video on this, was the level of accuracy that went into this was pretty impressive. I thought I don't know if it's Skrein, how you pronounce his surname,
Right,
but
yeah.
as Dick Best was actually pretty good. I actually really liked him as a character. He's one of those actors that he does a good job most of the time, but he's never really seemed to have. I mean, this would have been, I guess, his main sort of starring role,
Yeah.
but unfortunately, I don't think this did that well in the box office. From what, it
No.
wasn't received well either.
Yeah, he seems to just have this, like I'm trying to think of the other actor we kind of have come across like that like they never seem to get a break and everything.
Yeah.
I guess what's it called, Barry Pepper, I guess, is kind of similar. Kind of
Yeah.
they they're decent actors, but they just don't seem to kind of get these breakout roles for some reason. Like even when they are like kind of a breakout role in some ways and stuff. So I think it's just maybe just somehow they just haven't gotten the right breaks. I mean, they just haven't gotten the right kind of fit and stuff like that. So who knows?
And I think Woody Harrelson, Dennis Quaid both do a great job in this movie. You know, I think the one failing of this movie really, I mean, it is, I thought the recreation of the battles was really good. I think the historical accuracy is really good. It's the dialogue that really brings this movie down, because the dialogue is very cliched. It seems like everyone has smoked an entire pack of cigarettes and has got their tough guy World War II voice on. So it all just it just lacks a certain level of humanity, unfortunately. But
yeah, I think the acting is there, but the dialogue kind of makes it almost like a like a typical B movie and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so really brings it down. And I had to hate to say it, but I think it really comes down to like kind of the director Roland Emmerich, because we saw like kind of the same kind of thing with Godzilla and stuff. So kind of what's called. Hopefully, at some point he'll get some better writing for stuff. Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that normally you have a suspension of disbelief because you like the characters and the actual events don't really make any sense, or there's massive plot holes. What's interesting is the events and everything is perfectly realistic, really.
Right.
And it's actually the characters that you have to kind of take a step back and go, yeah, well, they're a bit crap, but this is an interesting sort of juncture in World War II, so I'll follow it along. And I mean, I was actually pretty moved by the end of it to see Ed Skrein, his character, Bess, the fact that he kind of had the bad oxygen mix and he still went through all that and destroyed like all those bombers and went back to his sort of family and was like, couldn't fly again. It was, you realize the amount that these guys went through is just incredible, really.
Yeah, I think that's like probably the one of the strongest aspects of it. It was just, that like you saw this guy and what he went through, and you're there, like kind of experienced it with him, was like that. And then you realize kind of, what not only the stakes were, but also like kind of, the price he paid and stuff. And then like, it definitely made it like a nicer payoff that he made it through all that and stuff. And,
And when you've seen like the first raid go wrong and the torpedoes that miss or don't ignite and things like this, and you just think, okay, that was supposed to be the point where you got the edge, which raises the stakes even higher. It means actually very, very tense, I think, because they really build that. They really accurately portray how this scenario had to win.
That's again like kind of that's how the technology is there to kind of really tell you things that like like the original just couldn't do on stuff. But what's funny is that like the original, as much as they cobbled together as kind of like really scrimping the budget and all that kind of stuff, it did a 10x. Like like it did the box office did 10x what like kind of the budget was and stuff like that. And meanwhile, this one like kind of barely broke even and stuff like that. So it's kind of considered a bomb in some ways.
Yeah. No pun intended.
And that's what's kind of sad, that like we have the technology, we kind of are able to kind of tell things much better and stuff like that, but yet it's definitely not a guarantee for movie succeeding and stuff. And it's this guy's passion project too, so that's what's kind of like an interesting angle to all this.
I mean, I wasn't expecting a lot from it, to be honest with you, but I actually really enjoyed it. I thought it was actually a really fascinating movie, just because of the level of accuracy that had been invested in it. I mean, Nick Jonas, he was okay.
That was an interesting choice.
Yeah.
that and the other one was I thought was an interesting choice was the Darren Kriss, right? Who I know from Glee and everything like that as one of the torpedo squadron commanders and stuff. I was like, okay, what's with these musical, kind of dudes, like,
Yeah.
Like you kept feeling like they're gonna break out this kind of some song and dance, routine or something.
Yeah, that would have been something. Yeah, but a huge amount of attention to detail as well.
Yeah.
I mean the carriers all look very realistic, the clothing, everything else. So that was all really interesting. Well executed. This is one of those ones where actually it's kind of I'm wondering if over time people will not look on this quite so harshly and realize it was actually a pretty good movie.
Right.
I mean, for the running time is 2.5 hours, I want to say, roughly.
Yeah, and that's another kind of trend that we typically see, like it's just a little over, like just under 2.5 hours, but it's funny how like these movies that like the 70s or the kind of the original will be like an hour and a half or something like that, and then the remakes will all go over 2 hours, and that like because they just want to pack in that much more and stuff. But war isn't definitely not necessarily better, like kind of
Yeah, but I mean, I actually I sat through it all in one sitting and was quite it was not a slow 2.5 hours for me. Yeah. So, and I thought it was interesting to see the perspective of the Japanese generals, or the admirals, I should say. We had Raiden from Mortal Kombat resuming his role as, I can't remember the character's name now, but yeah, he was a familiar face.
Right.
You might have to look up his name, but
the Yamamoto, I guess.
Yeah, and it was nice in the sort of closing credits to see, the actual stories of the real people that were involved, and what had happened to them and where they got to. But yeah, I mean, Nimitz is when he's given that instruction to basically you're going to go and take on this impossible task, and your job's not done until you're landing in Tokyo Bay. That's a pretty tall order, but
he was the right guy to do it, apparently.
Yeah, clearly. So yeah, definitely one of those rare occasions where I actually really enjoyed the remake a lot more than the original. And it's funny because even though I suppose you can poke holes in it saying it doesn't use the authentic footage, it's no less a movie for that, I don't think. I think the CGI is, again, it's kind of, you just have to kind of take that step back and just sort of say to yourself, well, this is about as close as we can get to the real thing. So you can give it, I think you can give it a pass for that.
Definitely. Yeah, I think pretty much that sums up the kind of that, like, here's this movie that kind of really set out to do better than the original and stuff like that, and they did to like kind of it almost all the boxes except for as we talked about the dialogue and stuff like that, and just unfortunately like kind of the maybe the timing or kind of just the box office wasn't so kind to the movie, but then maybe time will be. Yeah, definitely. I agree that like it's definitely a worthwhile watch. To especially like if you're not familiar with like kind of the battles and stuff. For me, like just besides having served and stuff, as part of your training is studies in naval science, and this is like one of those key battles that like as a student of that. You're like kind of, it's not even indoctrination, but it's drilled into you the significance of this stuff. And I think what's funny is sometimes with all this kind of stuff is that there's a little bit of this kind of narrative fallacy that like in some ways we talk about like all these things kind of happen. So I mean, there's no doubt that the decoding kind of the AF and identifying Midway as the target was a key aspect of like kind of success and stuff. But there were critical moments where the battle could have gone easily to either way and stuff like that. And there was luck, absolutely. Like there was a lot of heart and people like kind of really sacrificing and kind of pouring their hearts into kind of the outcomes like that. but there's certain key moments that like one of the things that they actually pointed out was like the pilot Wade McClusky, played by Luke Evans from Three Musketeers. He kind of looks down and he sees that like there's this why is that destroyer like kind of full steam and stuff like that. And oh, by the way, it's leading them to the main fleet because they had to get away, like kind of break off and stuff like that. And that was a key, one of those key moments that like like it was this kind of like insight and slash he saw it, and then kind of that led them to kind of make that attack and everything. The other kind of bad luck for the Japanese was the fact that like they had all the bombs and kind of they're mixing bombs and torpedoes. They were trying to decide whether to try to go for the new sighting of the American fleet or to head back to Midway to make another attack. And then so all this ammunition was lying around, and then here comes the Americans, whoops, kind of. And then that's like unfortunate for them but lucky for the Americans that like they found them so exposed, because as you can imagine with that kind of munition kind of all laying around, it was just perfect timing that like just where normally things are at least stowed and somewhat out of the way and stuff like that, but just the fact that like they were all over the decks and all like kind of exposed and stuff like that, that then these carriers just went off like powder kegs and stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's this one thing is it's hard to sort of relay in the movie, I guess, but they're talking about like what, a 45-minute hour window when that was the case, when they were actually rearming those planes. Right. So that's what this is a battle that's taken weeks to prepare. It's taking hours for ships and everything to position themselves, but it really comes down to this one crucial hour. Yeah. When luck was just on their side. I think that's what's really effective about this, is that you see how luck, went for and against both sides at each at very key moments. The torpedoes just like missing, or bombing run that on the first run doesn't work and does on the second one. So it's very effective, I thought. Definitely. And compared to say something else like another modern war movie, something like Dunkirk, which was more successful, I guess. I felt in a way I kind of enjoyed this more than Dunkirk, because I don't think Dunkirk gives you, it gives you the realistic perspective of what was happening to people during the attack, but it doesn't give you the wider perspective and the strategic angle of what was actually going on and why this was important. And so I thought that was sort of slightly, different approach maybe, but I think I kind of preferred this approach, I would say.
Yeah, so coming up, Dan and I talked a little bit about his upcoming visit to the States and LA, which will offer him a chance to catch a little bit more into the Southern California culture. So we're moving up our look at Valley Girl, and we'll be discussing that. And then further down the road, we'll be looking at the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles as a interesting kind of subculture, I guess, of the comics. And so I'm once again John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you next time.